My name is Kelly Agan, and I am part of the State Library of North Carolina's Government and Heritage Library. Thank you all for joining us today for our program. This program is being presented in celebration of Jewish American Heritage Month, and we encourage everyone after the program's over to visit jewishheritagemonth.gov to learn more about the month-long celebration. I would also like to introduce our speaker after all those housekeeping details are out of the way. And I want you to just bear with me while I actually read Barbara's biography. She has had a wonderfully varied life and has made lots of community contributions. Barbara grew up in Philadelphia, and she has lived in the Research Triangle area since 1972. She received an A.B. cum laude from Bryn Mawr College and then an M.S. in library science from Drexel University. She had a long career as a librarian at Burroughs Wellcome, and then she, as she says, quote, retired to her new career of family and community volunteering. She has been active in the Raleigh Jewish community for many years, and she has served as president of Beth Temple Orr. She has also been president of the Junior League of Raleigh, and she's been active in the City of Raleigh's Historic Resources and Museum program. She is also a treasurer of the Raleigh Hebrew Cemetery, and she is currently president of the Triangle Jewish Genealogical Society. Barbara and her husband, Mitch, have 2 sons and 3 grandchildren, and she says that her family tree is dedicated to them. I also want to share that Barbara has shared her expertise and her research journey with us before here at the Government and Heritage Library, and we are thrilled to have her back after a few years lapse with the pandemic today to share a new topic with us. Today she's going to be sharing tracing your Jewish roots in Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. And for many of us, this is really a new area and an important area of inquiry for us to learn about. And it's also particularly timely as recent events have unfolded in the situation in Ukraine and among its neighbors. So we really hope that we will learn a lot of valuable context from Barbara today to help us all in our research. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Barbara. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for inviting me, Kelly. When we started talking about this topic as something I might talk about, it was about the 3rd week in February, and there was this little thing going on in Ukraine, and Mr. Putin told us it would just be a couple of days, and then things would get back to normal, whatever normal was. But here we are, and we've watched a country basically be ground, not into nothing, but ground the way a country is when it's involved in a major war, which it has been. And I think that has made us all look at this region of the world a little bit differently. If you're an American Jew my age, which is 73, the chances are pretty good that your grandparents and great-grandparents came from Ukraine, Poland, or Belarus. Some came from Germany and Hungary and Romania, but mainly during the period of time we're talking about from Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. And so we look at those 3 regions as, sometimes we look at them as one region, and they do have a similar history, which I'll talk a little bit about. But we have mixed feelings about it because the non-Jews who lived in those countries were often very anti-Semitic and participated in pogroms against Jews. They took rights away from Jews. The Russian army, when these countries were part of Russia, could draft a young Jewish man for 25 years. When you hear about Mr. Putin using conscripts in the current Russian army, it's the same kind of thing. They could not rise above private, and they would have to serve if they survived for 25 years. Of course, nobody survived 25 years in the Russian army. And so we sort of have mixed feelings. Well, Ukraine's been invaded by Russia. Are we supposed to feel sympathetic for these people who killed our people? But I think over this time, since that third week in February, we have changed our attitude toward these countries because they are now feeling the effects that Jews felt in 41, 42, 43, when the Nazis came in and murdered so many people. So I think our attitudes toward these countries have changed dramatically. This is our poster from today's session, and I put big versions of the pictures on there because I wanted you to have a chance to look at them. The lady in the high collar blouse wearing the locket is my grandmother named Sarah, my mother's mother. And she is also the woman sitting on the screened-in back porch at my parents' home with my little sister Janet. Janet is now 70 and a grandmother of 8 herself. But I love this picture because that screened-in porch was so important to us. And we knew this grandmother really, really well. She didn't live too far from us. My mother called her every day. They would have these great phone conversations, and then when it got really interesting, they would lapse into Yiddish, and you would sort of miss the punchline. But I knew her very well. And when I was in confirmation class, which is 10th grade, we had an assignment to interview a grandparent and write a paper about what their life had been like to that point. And it was kind of interesting because I'd heard stories here and there. She told us little bits of things. But to actually be able to interview her about her life was interesting. And I guess I thought I was Barbara Walters at the time, but I asked her, what was it like living under the Tsar? And this is what she did. She turned her head to the side and she went, and that was all she would say about life under the Tsar. We knew that she had left a town in what she called White Russia. I never heard the term Belarus growing up. It was always White Russia. She had left by herself and come to Philadelphia. An uncle, her mother's brother, had bought her ticket, so her mother's brother was already here. And this is what the former guy called chain migration, the great evil of chain migration, was the Vetter Herschel Abilov paying for Sarah Wolfson's ticket to the United States. She came in 1907 and she came through Baltimore, which was a very, very busy port for immigrants. Everybody thinks about Ellis Island, but both Philadelphia and especially Baltimore were huge. Very many Jews who ended up in the South came through Baltimore rather than through New York. She told us she had a little piece of paper in her hand that had her uncle's address in Philadelphia. And somebody from a charitable organization helped her get on the train and get to Philadelphia. That organization was the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS, which today is very active in helping refugees from all over the world, including Afghanistan, including Ukraine. So how did I get into the genealogy thing? I was always fascinated by her background. The paper I wrote in confirmation class was interesting, but I still didn't have a lot of factual material. So this guy in this picture is my younger son, David. He's a lawyer, and he's a little argumentative, as lawyers will be. And one day we'd been to some family event, and he said to me, "Mom, you have to make me a family tree. I don't understand who all these people are. You act like I know who they are, and I have no idea, so please help me out." So I proceeded to work on a family tree. It wasn't really the family tree that he wanted, but it was the family tree that I wanted. For example, I knew that my mother had a lot of cousins here, but I didn't know how they were related to me. And my mother died in 1986, so I missed the chance to ask her those questions. And my father, who knew all those cousins too, he just said to me one day, oh, they're landsmen. They weren't really relatives. Landsman means from the same place. But unfortunately, that was not the case. They were actually related, and I discovered in what ways they were related. Why did they leave Europe? Why did they come to the United States and others stayed in White Russia? In the case of my grandmother and her husband, both came from a town called Rogachev, and it's not a small place. It was a city of about 40,000 then, and it's considerably larger now. What was life like for them in Europe around the turn of the 20th century? What was their journey like? What was their life here? For the people who didn't leave, what happened to them after 1918? What happened to them during World War II? What happened to them when the Soviet Union broke up in 1989? Those were the kinds of questions that I was looking to find the answer for. So David had to wait for his tree, and I don't know that he'll ever look at my tree on Ancestry.com, but you know, the argumentative lawyer asks me about it every once in a while. So who are we looking for? We are looking for our known Jewish ancestors here. How did they get here? Who brought them? What did they find when they got here? What was their name when they left Europe? What was their name when they settled in the United States or in Canada? We're particularly interested in ancestors from what's called the Pale of Settlement, which I'll describe later, which was basically the three countries we're talking about. I eventually had my DNA tested. I actually did it on two different platforms, Ancestry.com and MyHeritage.com, and found different sets of cousins, but some surprises also. And then there's another platform called Geni, some pronounce it Jenny, Geni, which is One World Family Tree. And on that family tree, you don't search for records like census or draft cards or anything like that. You put in what you know about a person, date of death, date of birth, place where they were born, place where they died, and the One World Family Tree, which is what Geni calls itself, hooks you up with other people who have that person on their tree. Because, you know, if you believe we're all descended from Adam and Eve, we're all one family tree. And we're also looking for the lost, the people who were murdered by Nazis, people who died in the Russian Revolution, in the Soviet Union's Gulag, in the Holocaust, in displaced person camps, and in Chernobyl, which, by the way, Chernobyl is in Ukraine, and it's not very far from the part of White Russia where my family is from. And Chernobyl had a big effect on people living in that area. I would recommend that the way to start a family tree is to write down everything you know about your grandparents and your great-grandparents. What you know about their birth dates, their death dates, where they were born, where they died, how they came to the United States. Now, there might be big gaps in this, but at least it gives you a chance to set out what it is you know. Sketch out a tree, and it doesn't have to be fancy, and it doesn't have to have all the bells and whistles that an online family tree have, but get something down on paper so that you have an idea of who these folks are. I say get something down on paper. Of course, you could do it on an Excel spreadsheet, which is the way my children would do it, but and start looking for official documents. And you can do that in lots of ways. You can go to a commercial system like Ancestry.com or MyHeritage.com. And for a minimal membership, or maybe no membership at all, a lot of public libraries have a free copy of Ancestry.com, you can begin looking, and you can find the United States Census up to 1950 now. You can find immigration documents. You can find draft registration cards for World War I and World War II. And those have a lot of information on them. For example, they tell where a person worked. They tell the name of the person who will always know where they are. So you're likely to get the name of a spouse or a parent. There's just tons of information. And then the other thing that to me is kind of emotional about these documents, like draft reservation cards, even if it's not in your ancestor's handwriting, you know that your ancestor was standing in front of a clerk and that information was being recorded. And that's emotional to me. When I think of Sarah's husband, whose name was Ben, filling out the draft registration for World War I, he had escaped from Russia to avoid conscription in the Russian army. He had heard that he was about to be drafted. This is a pretty common story, so I don't know how literally true it is for him, but he said that he was smuggled out of Belarus in a hay wagon buried under a couple of bales of hay, and that was how he got out. And I don't think that was uncommon. Maybe it's a simpler story, maybe somebody was paid off. Sometimes people bought identification documents and went out under someone else's non-Jewish name. But anyway, that's why he left White Russia. Don't limit yourself to a city. Millions of immigrants came through Ellis Island, but not everybody. And if they ended up in the South, look at Baltimore. If they ended up in Philadelphia, look at Philadelphia. And then the whole southern area, Galveston and Houston, had tons of immigrants. So broaden your search as broad as you can make it. And census results are just, there's so much on the census. And each census is a little bit different. And I'll show you one. This is the 1910 census for my husband's grandfather, whose name was Joseph Freedman. He lived in a section of Philadelphia called Manayunk at 167 Green Street, and I don't know if you can see it at the bottom of the page. He and his wife, Lily, in 1910 had 3 children. And I knew all of these children, so I feel like I'm making this connection. And I've cut off the census, a couple of columns of the census, but you can see that it shows you where they were born and where their parents were born and whether they owned or rented their house. I mean, there's just lots and lots of good information. In this census, they use Russia/Polish or Poland as the country. These countries changed borders all the time. So I actually think they were Ukrainian, but they lived in a part of Ukraine that may have belonged to Poland for a while. And so that's why it says Polish. And these folks, Joseph and Lily Freedman, I know that their English was very poor. It was very poor in the 60s when they died, and it certainly wasn't very good in 1910. So I think that their son Samuel may have been born in the United States rather than in Russia, Poland, but that would require further research. So where was he from, Joseph? These are 2 documents that are really important for immigrants at this time. The first is a declaration of intention. The immigrant fills out a form and says, I would like to become a citizen of the United States. And they give a lot of information. They say what ship they came over on and the last place they stayed in the old country and where they landed and And then the second document, which generally came 5 years later, in this case came much later, gives even more information about them. He was not naturalized till 1919. I don't know why. But they have more children, including my father-in-law, Edward. All the children and the wife become a citizen when the husband becomes a citizen. The women generally did not become citizens if they were not married. So when Joseph became a citizen, everybody else became a citizen. But these two forms have a tremendous amount of information, and the one on the Declaration of Naturalization, they actually went to court. So imagine these immigrants who maybe were a little bit scared of what court might be like, went into a federal court and swore allegiance to the United States and gave up allegiance to, mostly it was to Tsar Nicholas II, Tsar of all the Russias. So again, this information is available in a lot of different platforms, and it's not easy to find necessarily, but it's not terribly complicated. One of my problems in searching my family is that my family names are Cohen, Kaplan, and Schwartz. So you can imagine how many Lewis Cohens there are who came to Philadelphia in 1895. Quite a few. Sometimes it's easier if your name is not as common. Sarah's husband was Benjamin Kaplan, and this is from his World War I draft registration. And it says that he was a junk dealer, that he was self-employed, that he lived at 1209 Mifflin Street in Philadelphia, and that his business was at 1211 Mifflin Street in Philadelphia. Well, I made my children go on this family heritage tour, I called it, and this is 1209 and 1211 Mifflin Street. You can see the junk business was on the right-hand side, and the house where they lived was on the left-hand side. And I love the house. They lived in the house when they had 3 children. When my mother was born in 1920, they moved out to West Philadelphia where they had a little bit more room. So they have this small house, and it certainly only had 1 bathroom. I have a feeling that maybe when they started out there, it had outdoor facilities, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But again, Ben Kaplan was standing right in front of somebody when this form was filled out. The man who escaped White Russia to avoid conscription into the Russian army was registering for the draft in the United States. This business about names might be the most difficult thing that you come across in looking for your Jewish ancestors. Every Jewish child gets a Hebrew name, but Hebrew names are not used for everyday use because they are holy. They're more reserved for the synagogue. And so they get a Yiddish name. In this part of Europe, they got a Yiddish name. And then in the United States, they got an English name. And the immigrant parents tried to make them sound super American. And so some of the English names are funny. My father was Yehuda Lieb, son of Michael HaKohen. That was his father, Michael Cohen. He was always called Leba, which is the typical name for anything that starts with an L. But in English, he was Lester, and he always hated Lester. He told me when he was 92, he hated Lester, and he didn't understand why his mom had picked Lester. But there were Lesters, and there were Leonards, and there were other fancy names with L's. Jews did not have last names until the beginning of the 19th century. They used this son of convention, and but the countries they lived in required them to take last names at that time so that they could be mainly for tax records. And so the last names that Jews took, first of all, they were often Yiddish, so they kind of stood out in places that spoke Russian or Ukrainian, or there's a Belarusian dialect. They took a name like Wolfson, which is really a German name. And a lot of times mothers' names are completely omitted from their naming, so you can't distinguish different sons of Lewis but by the mom's name. That's just not there. Hebrew names and Yiddish names are written in Hebrew characters, and they can be transliterated into something we can read in the Arabic alphabet, but they're not much easier to understand. The folks who came as immigrants at this time, I would say their first language was Yiddish 90% of the time. Yiddish was the language that developed in Germany during medieval times. It was written in Hebrew script and had a lot of German roots and a lot of Hebrew roots. There's a fabulous literature in Yiddish, which, you know, the audience for that is shrinking, but there's beautiful poetry, there's wonderful stories. Their second or third language was Russian or Polish or German, depending on where they lived, so that they could communicate with the government mainly. The records that were kept of Jewish citizens were kept with each town, but each town's records moved around based on what the government was like. And so, for example, some of the Minsk marriage records, well, Minsk is always in Minsk, but some of the Rogachev marriage records are in Homel and some are in Minsk. It can be very confusing about where the records are stored for each town. Cemeteries are often a wonderful source for information about people who lived in a place. However, over the years, many Jewish cemeteries have been desecrated and destroyed. The Germans did a lot of it, but then after World War II, the governments in Eastern European countries did it a lot. They took the gravestones and used them as pavers to build roads and to build foundations of buildings. There are a couple of cities where these soccer stadiums are built over places where there were Jewish cemeteries. Joseph Freedman, my husband's grandfather, was actually not, as you might suspect from the spelling of Freedman, named Joseph Freedman when he left, and he left Odessa on a ship. His name was Jasel, which is Yiddish for Joseph, Arbis, A-R-B-I-S. And when he got to Baltimore, which is where he came in, he, and you can see it on the ship manifest, he asks to be called Joseph Freedman. Well, the Joseph part makes sense. We have no idea where the Freedman name comes from, and it's not a German spelling, obviously. You know, people used to say, oh, your name was changed at Ellis Island, but that didn't actually happen. The Ellis Island people and all the immigration officials were very specific about making the documents match up. But if you asked to have your name changed, it would be changed when you got to the United States. We have no idea how or why he chose Freedman. I haven't found a cousin. Sometimes people picked a cousin's name, but we just don't know. But there's a lot that's mysterious about Joseph Freedman. The ship he came on was called the Friesland. And if you look on the left side of the page, above the X, there's a picture of the Friesland. And this little brochure shows that this particular voyage, this ship sailed from Liverpool, but he sailed from Odessa. And it says list of passengers. But I can assure you that Joseph Freedman's name would not be on a list, because the immigrant passengers had tickets for steerage, which was the space below the waterline in the ship, in the hold of the ship. And I don't think they were listed on any list. The accommodations were terrible. It was cold, it was dark, screaming children, you know, everything you can imagine. My grandmother, who came on a similar ship and who was very observant about the dietary laws of Judaism, brought with her 24 hard-boiled eggs. I guess they were refrigerated in the hold, but she was afraid to eat anything on the ship, afraid that it would be made with pork. And so she had these 24 hard-boiled eggs with her, just to give her something to eat. And the other thing you'll notice is that for Jasel Arbis, coming from Odessa, he is listed as a Hebrew. Hebrew both as his race and his nationality. Now, this is a concept that today, you know, makes us bristle. What does this mean? Well, first of all, Jew and Jewish were considered epithets. And you would never put those two words, you would never say them in polite conversation, and you would not put them on a document. So the term Hebrew was used. It became common to refer to things that were Jewish as being Hebrew. Right down the street from here, about 10 blocks, is Raleigh Hebrew Cemetery, which was founded in 1912. Cemeteries founded later would have been called Raleigh Jewish Cemetery, but Hebrew was the term at this time. So I've mentioned the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement was an invention of Catherine the Great, or as I like to call her, Catherine the Not So Great, who decided to create a place where Jews could live, and they couldn't live anywhere else in Russia. They couldn't live in Moscow, they couldn't live in St. Petersburg, but they could live in these places. And this actually turns out to be a pretty good map of Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. At the top is the Baltic Sea, at the bottom is the Black Sea. You can see at the bottom, in the Ukraine area, you can see Yalta, and Bessarabia, which is Moldova, and some names that look familiar: Kyiv, Kherson, Ekaterinoslav, areas that we've talked about a lot in the last few months about Ukraine. North of that, you see the Belarusian cities, Minsk, Mogilev, Grodno, and then north of that and west of that, you see some parts of Poland. This area, although it changed in shape and size over the years, was the area that the czars said was where Jews could live. Now, they could live here, and they could work here, and they could pay taxes here, and they could get drafted from here. But what they could not do was own property, and they could not attend the university. And so they couldn't get educated into professions like medicine and law, which Jews had always been very successful at. And the reason was that they could not swear allegiance to the Tsar, because the Tsar was the head of the church as well as head of state. The land in the Pale of Settlement was very fertile. We know about Ukraine being the breadbasket of the world. But Jews weren't particularly good farmers. It's not clear why. It's sort of an inside joke. in the Jewish community that Jews aren't very good farmers. Maybe it's the requirements of observing Judaism that keep them from being able to pay as much attention to farms. So Jews who lived in this area were merchants. They owned some small factories in the town where my grandmother was from. There were rope factories, which were actually owned by Jews, and small businesses. And every family had a cow, and every family had a few chickens, even if you lived in the city. So people could be a little bit independent. But people who came to the United States from the Pale of Settlement during the period 1875 to 1914 were generally at the top of the lower class, at the bottom of the middle class in terms of what their financial situation was. Even though you had to live in the Pale of Settlement, there were still cities you couldn't live in. You couldn't live in Kyiv. The term pale, by the way, pale comes from the Latin palus, which is a stake. So if you think of a fence, it's got stakes and then something connecting those stakes. So that's where the pale comes from. And when we talk about something being beyond the pale, we're talking about this Pale of Settlement. No, you can't do that. That's for beyond the pale. And this little house is actually a house in Rogachev in 2018 that a cousin of mine took a picture of. I'll tell you a little bit about her. But very much like the housing they left probably in 1907. So here's Belarus. It literally means white Russia. You don't confuse it with the whites and the reds, which was a political disagreement in Russia after World War I. Some of the cities are very old. You'll notice some that we've heard about in the news. Of course, Minsk is the capital city. Down in the lower right, you will see Rahachachow, that's the Russian spelling of Rogachev, where my grandparents are from. My husband has grandparents from Babrusk, Babrysk. And if you follow the river from Rogachev, go into Ukraine, the first thing you come to is Chernobyl, and then you come to Ekaterinoslav, which thank goodness is now much shorter, called Dnipro, which we heard a lot about in this Ukrainian war. So you can see that Belarus is got the Baltic states north, Latvia and Lithuania, Poland to the west, Ukraine to the south, Russia to the east. This is Ukraine, and so many of these cities will be familiar to you. And Odessa on the Black Sea, I can hear in my mind my 8th grade geography teacher, Mr. Granger, at Drexel Hill Junior High School, saying to us, Russia has always wanted a warm water port. Oh my gosh, they're still looking for a warm water port. And that's Odessa. And you can see all the other cities that we've become so familiar with. And this is Poland. Poland is by far the largest of these countries and the most densely populated. I think you can tell this. All of my life until recently, I avoided reading much about the Holocaust. I couldn't take it. But recently, I have learned what I should have known all along, that Poland is the country in which more Jews died than any other country during World War II. In 1897, there were 725,000 Jews in Belarus, which was 13% of the population. From 1941 to 1943, 800,000 Jews were murdered in Belarus, some of them coming from Poland and Ukraine. And because they were relatively far from Germany, there were a few labor camps, but there was not the system of camps that they had in Poland and Germany. And generally what happened was the Jews of a town were called to dig a pit, and then they were told to get into the pit, remove all jewelry and all clothing, and they were shot and buried in the pit that they had dug. And that was the typical means of execution by the Nazis. And in Rogachev, this happened at least twice in 1941 and 1942. And between 1989 and 1991, 50,000 Jews left Belarus for Israel. This was when the Soviet Union collapsed. So the numbers had obviously fallen during that time. And this is what my grandmother believed had happened to her siblings. She left a brother and 4 sisters when she came to the United States. And she always told us she wrote to them until about 38 or 39, and then after that, and she would say, no more. Never heard from them again. So of course we just all assumed that they were dead. That was, what else could you assume? So this is our little timeline of what went on in the 3 countries. Most people would recommend that when you begin your search for your Jewish roots, you should go to jewishgen.org. One of the things that it does is that it tells you about all the towns with the name of your town, which you should have an idea by this time of what town your ancestors came from. There are only 2 for Rogachev, but some places have 1 million. I mean, think of Russia. Think how big Russia is. You could have 1 in every region, and Russia has like 37 regions. But it gives you great information. It tells you where it was after World War II, between the wars, before World War I, and it tells you how many people are actually looking for family in those areas. And you can click on that and see the names. I thought I'd tell you what Rogachev is famous for. The little drawing that accompanies our poster is by an artist named Anatoly Kaplan, who was from Rogachev and painted pictures of villages like Rogachev. He actually somehow was able to go to Leningrad and study art and became quite famous in the art world. The hockey player is Sergei Boutin, and I think you can tell from the initials on his uniform that he actually played for a Belarusian national team. I went to the hockey game last night, so I've got hockey on my mind, and I thought it would be good to have Sergei in there. There's a famous rabbi from Rogachev who was known to be pretty much memorized the entire Talmud. That would kind of be like memorizing the entire Encyclopedia Britannica. And the other thing that Rogachev is famous for to this day, that picture of what looks like a can of condensed milk is a glass mosaic statue of a can of condensed milk, which is made in Rogachev and is imported throughout the entire former Soviet Union. Very popular, well-known product. I went to a wedding in 2016 and met a rabbi who said, well, if you're interested in finding relatives, you need to get on Genie, the One World family tree. Well, I had been on Genie before, but I was confused because I couldn't find any documents on Genie, and I didn't quite get what it was. But I went back to Genie at his recommendation. I figure, if a rabbi recommends it, it can't be all bad. And I Googled my great-grandmother's name, and I happened to know her maiden name because her brother had been the one who brought my grandmother over. And I got a hit on Genie. And it's this woman who died when she was 82, I looked at her name and I said, oh, this is a mistake. How could this be? She can't be related to me. And then it says she was the daughter of Schneier Velvel Wolfson and Perla Abilov Wolfson. Those are my great-grandparents. And as I looked through Jeannie, I realized that my grandmother's sisters had survived World War II. It turns out they had gone east. They had gone to Siberia in a city called Barnaul, and they had lived there for 5 or 6 years and then come back to Belarus. And this was her sister Elke. And I remembered that I had found something about an E. Wolfson and a B. Kaplan, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. It was the purchase of a steamship ticket. And this is the dock where immigrants came in to Philadelphia. And this is a book that you used to have to search by hand at Temple University, but in the Jewish archives, but now it's all been digitized and I could do it from my desk in Raleigh. But this is what it said. Benny Kaplan, 1209 Mifflin Street, next door to that beautiful garage, bought a ticket for Elke Wolfson, age 18, residing with Gabriel Merkin in Rogachev Mogilev, sailing from Libau to Philadelphia. And he bought the cost of the ticket was $38. He paid down $10 and he was to pay $28 in 30 days. So he actually had bought her a ticket, but the problem is he bought her a ticket, I'm not sure it says on this page, in 1914. And she couldn't get out of Europe in 1914. But I didn't know this until then. I had some DNA testing done and found a couple of people as cousins who I'd never heard of. One is Damar Pollock and one is Polina Porozhansky, and they both lived in Buffalo, New York. That also didn't make a lot of sense to me. And on the right, there's a picture of me with Polina, two of her brothers, and in the middle is a cousin of ours. He's really a cousin. His grandparents were first cousins of all of us. And so we're first cousins of each other. So if we ever got a hold of his DNA, it would be crazy. But he's never had it done. These are the resources that people generally work with to develop their family trees. I started with Ancestry. I like it. It has the most people of all of these genealogy platforms. It has the most number of records. Some people don't like it because it costs a lot of money, but it's really pretty great. My Heritage is another platform, and it's actually owned by an Israeli company. And so a lot of Jewish people have started with My Heritage, feeling that the connections there would be better. Both of those companies have DNA programs, but the interesting thing is that DNA testing is illegal in Israel. So if you live in Israel, you're not supposed to mail away your DNA sample and get the results back. People do, but you're not supposed to do it. Why is it illegal? Well, in Judaism, in religious Judaism, whether or not you're Jewish depends on whether your mother is Jewish. And they don't want to discover anybody whose mother actually wasn't Jewish. And people joke and say, no more mamzers, no more bastards. We're just not going to look at this. We're going to go with the records that we have. Family Search is another very fine platform, and it is owned by the Church of Latter-day Saints, but trust me, they're not trying to convert our ancestors. That was an accusation against the church for a long time. They're very helpful, and their local history centers are extremely helpful. JewishGen.org has documents that nobody else has. They have indexing that nobody else has. They have tons of volunteers all over the world who translate, they've digitized a lot, but they've also translated a lot. And so every time you look, you might see something new. The Yad Vashem platform is from Israel. Yad Vashem is the memorial to those who died in the Holocaust, and they have all kinds of witness testimony talking about people who died in the Holocaust and people who survived the Holocaust. Genie.org is the One World Family Tree. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington has tons of stuff, and there are 1 million Facebook pages. And you know, for whatever they're worth, there are people translating on Facebook. There are people explaining what names mean on Facebook. It's very good, given what it is. I think the first of these was a Facebook page called Tracing the Tribe, and it can lead you to some of the other pages. So, as I said, some of the Wolfson family did survive. I have discovered cousins in Mexico and Israel. I have a cousin in Israel who was born in Russia and then came to Israel and went to university and is a computer guy. And he sends to Minsk asking for records, writing in Russian, and then he translates them into perfect English. And he's an engineer, and he's just extremely precise. So it's like the ideal person. And he's very interested in genealogy. It's wonderful. So I've had the chance to meet people like that. I've discovered a few interesting things. There's a couple cousins who went to jail for various things. One was a numbers runner for a famous mafia family, and one was in the liquor business. So you never know what people are up to. There are a couple of family feuds that were well known that I can't get to the bottom of and probably never will. Jasel Arbis, Joseph Freedman's wife, came to this country, you know, a journey of 5,000 miles. She had a brother who was already here. They then proceeded not to speak to each other for 60 years. Why? Why would you do that? But as you know, families are strange. And I still have not gotten to the bottom of the why did they leave when so many others stayed. My daughter-in-law has an interesting story in her family. She has a great aunt who actually went back to Europe to try to persuade relatives in the 30s to leave, and they wouldn't leave. I don't know how often that went on, but you can see her on the ship going over and coming back. But her family never made the change. You know, the glory to Ukraine, which is the motto of Ukraine, is actually a call and response. And the response is glory to the heroes. And so I just want to say today, as far as Ukraine goes and all of these immigrants who came to the United States, glory to the heroes.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you. That was fantastic and a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us today. That is, I mean, for me, that just was not only touching, but so informative, and I really appreciate you agreeing to come in person.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's just stop there. So we have time for a few questions, and I'm going to actually take the questions from Zoom first. I know we said we'd start with the audience, but we have a few questions in Zoom. So Barbara, the first question is, how does locating vital records for countries and communities in Eastern Europe, do you know, differ from locating vital records in the U.S.?
Well, if people married in their birth country and came here, if you're interested in the date they were married, and if you're trying to go further back, I actually have been able to go a little bit further back. I've found some of Lily Markov Freedman's father and grandfather in Ukraine. I didn't actually find them. A man from Ukraine who lived in Philadelphia, who was going home to visit, offered to do some of that research for me. And I paid him, I think, like maybe $60 for each record, which I thought was a deal. And so I have some of that information if you're trying to go further back than the group that immigrated. It turns out that he did this with several people in the same family tree, but it was okay. I feel like people in his situation probably don't have a lot of money. But you know, you have an urge to go further back. I mean, well, you know, Schneier Velvel Wolfson was a teacher. What did his father do? What was his father's name? It's kind of interesting to see those records.
Okay, thank you. So, and I think you touched on the next question a little bit, or when you were talking about the 18th, the 19th, early 20th century in Eastern Europe, but a little bit more about the role of changing national borders and how that affects finding records, if it does.
It's mainly has to do with language. Language is one thing. Lots of Polish records, and Poland is the place where I'm the least knowledgeable, but parts of Poland belong to so many different countries that you need to have German and Russian and Polish, depending on what time. The other thing that makes it hard is you don't know if records are missing because the part of the country you're looking at changed hands, or if it's just because somebody tossed the records. And were they destroyed in the war? It's really hard to figure out. If you're trying to be comprehensive in your search, you're just not sure. And what effect the current war has had on this is interesting. I think we're still waiting to know if documents have been destroyed or burned in buildings that burned down or whatever.
Okay, thank you. I also want to share a comment that came in from the Zoom audience. This is from Susan, and she said, Barbara, I loved the personal stories. I am not Jewish, but my grandson's father's people are and came from a small town in Belarus. The personal stories breathe life into the research on this family. So, yeah, I'm sure everybody attending has really just appreciated that. We are at 11 o'clock. I know I would love to stay and talk all day actually about this, and I know there are a couple of other people sitting here who would as well. If anyone has any questions after the presentation, things that occur to you, please connect with the State Library. We'll be sharing our contact information in Zoom right now, and you can connect with us by email, you can connect with us by phone, and we would be glad to field your questions, try to help you, and also share them with Barbara. And also, please give us feedback about today's program. Your experience today is really vital to us to continue to develop programs, to improve our programming. So please grab the link that's being shared with you in chat. If you're joining us in person, you can take a photo of this very large QR code on the screen, and that will take you right to the survey. And again, we are going to follow up in a couple of days with a recording of Barbara's presentation on the State Library's YouTube channel, along with resources and websites that she has mentioned in her talk today. So that we're nearly done, and I just want to thank folks here in the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources and the State Library for support today for this. First, Matt Zaire from the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources Marketing and Communications Group. He has masterminded all the tech and AV details that allowed us to do our first hybrid live Zoom program. Thank you, Matt. And I want to thank Jen Hampf, also of the State Library, for being our Zoom host, along with Denise Jones, who was also providing support for sharing all those resources with you in chat. And again, thank you to Barbara for just such a beautiful and informative presentation. We hope to see you here again soon. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. We can't do what we do without you as well. And we wish everybody good luck on their own research journeys, and share your stories with us as well. So thank you very much. We hope you all have a good day.